All right, welcome to Reason. I'm sorry. Start over. Welcome to Underground Catholicism. I was on Reason and Theology earlier. I'm still on that mode. I am really excited today. I have Allan Ruhl here today. He is a Catholic apologist. He is actually my first guest that I've ever had on my show. I've only had this show for about a couple months, but he's my first guest, and I'm honored to have him to talk about the Crusades. He's going to talk about all four of them, but the first three, he's just going to give a general overview, and he's going to emphasize the fourth one. But before I do that, I do want to let everyone know that Allan Ruhl is a wonderful, wonderful Catholic apologist. I highly recommend his work if you go on YouTube. And in fact, if you're watching this, if you could, go on YouTube, type in Allan, Allan, space Ruhl, and subscribe to his YouTube channel. He has 900 and almost 60 subscribers. We're trying to get this guy to 1,000 because he deserves it. And we want to spread his content out because he's putting out some good stuff that I think would help a lot of Catholics out there. So please subscribe to his channel. But Allan, if you want to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about you, about your background, your faith background. Have you always been Catholic? And all that good stuff before you want to start on the crusade stuff.
Yeah, my name's Allan, or Al for short. I'm a cradle Catholic, born on the Canadian prairies where I still live to this day. My dad's family is Protestant. Lapse. My dad doesn't practice his faith. My mom's family is Byzantine Catholic. So fortunately, I got the Catholic part. So I'm very happy about that. Sweet. Not much to say. I started my website back in 2015, and I've been posting regularly until now. That's allanruhl.com. And I started the YouTube channel a couple years back. And I basically started it because, I'd watch opponents of the true faith, opponents of Jesus Christ, people like James White attack the Catholic Church, and he'd be debating some guy who didn't know what he was talking about. And I knew the answer. That's the most frustrating thing in the world, when you're watching a debate and you don't, know the answer, except they don't. And it just and the same with like Muslim apologists and stuff. And to make a long story short, I thought, I know the Bible pretty well. I know church history pretty well, and I love our Lord Jesus Christ, and I want to make him known and honored there.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Allan. And you mentioned your website. I didn't even know you had one. That's great. I need to check that out because I've only seen your content on YouTube. So you've been in this since 2015. You've been in this for quite some time. That's fantastic. What got you into the Crusades in the first place?
Well, I like church history, and let's be honest, you can't think of a more exciting part about church history than the Crusades. It's like the Council of Nicaea is my favorite part of church history. Right after that's the Crusades. And like it takes place at such an important time, and it just shows that how powerful the Pope was. It would have been nicer to get some crusades a bit earlier, but they happen when they happen, and I like learning about it. And there's a lot of, with the Crusades, with the Inquisition, with the blood libel and all that junk, there's so many lies. There's people only use that in kind of like a soundbite way. It's like, oh yeah, the Crusaders went. My cousin once, who's a huge leftist, he said once, he's like, basically the Crusades were the Pope telling a bunch of knights in Europe to go kill a bunch of people in the Middle East. And that is unfortunately, that kind of caricature is what most people have about the Crusades. And that's a shame, because we should learn history. the way it should be learned. You know, if you want to learn about the Crusades, you don't go and talk about like you don't go listening to some guy from the Anti-Defamation League who's trying to shame the Catholic Church or something like that. You look to the primary sources. By the way, in my research, I read both Catholic and Islamic accounts. Like, look, I'm going to be quoting from this today. This is the biography of Saladin, or Salahuddin, by his companion Ibn Shaddad. And I also use Christian accounts. This is Fulche of Chartres. Like, I try to use both accounts because I want to know what happened. And the best way to do that is not to like pay attention to sound bites or some lecture by some self-hating Catholic or something like that. I'd like to know what history was by looking at the earliest sources, and I do that for everything, including non stuff not to do with church history. If I'm studying the history of like Japan, I'm trying to read as much stuff as possible. If it has nothing to do with church history, like I read a lot of history, not just church history. But when I do church history, I'm trying to read as early as possible. It's not always possible because sometimes a lot of it's not translated, and so like in that case, you try to do the best you can. But in this day and age, we're fortunate enough to have a lot of it translated. Now, unfortunately, sometimes it's only in an academic press, so therefore you got to pay a few extra dollars. But you know, it is what it is. You got to spend your money somewhere, right? So that's mine. I mean, I like to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll be honest with you, as I said, I was talking to Al before the show here a little bit ago, and I told him, look, this is not my topic of expertise at all. I don't know anything about this topic besides, you know, what they taught us in school, which is, I've always thought was a little bit off. I just had that hunch because, you know, they're always kind of misrepresenting the church. So why wouldn't they do it here? And so I really wanted to give you the platform here, and maybe we can go through the four. So if you want to dive in to the first one and let us know what the backgrounds and all the historical context and all that stuff. What was that one about, and what happened there for the First Crusades?
Yeah, so our goal is to build up to the Fourth Crusade, but unfortunately, the Fourth Crusade doesn't happen in a vacuum. If I started talking about it, I'd have to pause and explain some stuff. So I have to, because the Fourth Crusade, you need to know what's going on in Europe, what's going on in the Holy Land, what's going on in the Byzantine Empire. So instead of constantly putting in small anecdotes, we're going to, I'm going to narrate the first three Crusades in pretty good detail, not as much details as we're going to go in the fourth. We're going to go very in depth for that. But the first three, I'm going to give you a pretty good overview, so you'll basically know what happens. And yeah, is it okay if I start now?
Yeah, please do. Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, please go ahead and start.
Sure. Okay. And if you need me to elaborate, I'll just ask. And we'll pause after the three to see if you have any questions or are you confused about anything. But yeah. Okay, I'll start. Now, of course, in the 7th century, we saw the rise of Islam. And of course, Islam started with the Arabs. They're the first Muslims. And they basically, not long after Muhammad dies, they invade a bunch of land, including a lot of Christian land in the Middle East and North Africa, all the way up into Spain. They try going into France, but they're pushed back at Tours and at the famous Battle of Tours in 732 AD. And basically about starting the year 750, So about 120 years after Muhammad, they lose their spirit for jihad. There's no more spirit of jihad left in the Arabs. So they start building their civilizations now. They start building Spain. They built a pretty good civilization there. They got a pretty good one in Iraq too. Egypt and Syria were okay. And then you had parts of the Muslim world that were completely backward, like Arabia, Yemen, stuff like that. It's a mixed bag, essentially. And about by the year 1000, the Christians are starting to come back. They're starting to take more and more land in Spain. This is the Reconquista. They're starting to capture lands in the Mediterranean, like Sicily. And the Byzantine Empire is starting to gain land back. They gain Antioch in the late 900s, and they're even expanding back into northern Syria. So things are going very well for the Christians, both in Europe and in the Byzantine Empire. Now, at this time, it's important to know that the group in charge in Egypt is a group called the Fatimids, the Fatimid Caliphate. They're a group of Arabs who are Shia Muslims, and they're the ones in control of Jerusalem at this point. Now, throughout the 1000s, the Byzantine Empire, at the end of the Macedonian dynasty, which is around 1030, I don't know the exact year, they start to have some problems. They start losing to the Normans. The Normans from Normandy love raiding Byzantine territory. They just love it. And eventually they start chipping away. And this actually played a tiny bit of a role in the 1054 episode between Cardinal Humbert and Cerularius, which caused a schism between Greek and Latin Church. But anyway, fast forward. In 1071, the Byzantine emperor was a guy named Romanos IV. Being overly confident and not overly bright, he knows the Turks, who have just come from Central Asia through Iran, are camped on the border of the Byzantine Empire. This is pretty similar to the modern border between Turkey and Armenia, about there. And so Romanos IV, being overly confident and not overly bright, marches his army out to central Anatolia to engage the Turks. This is the Seljuk Turks under their leader Alp Arslan. And I don't think the Turks were planning on engaging the Byzantines. The Turks wanted to go to take over the Middle East, and especially go to war with the Fatimids, the Shias. But they get in a battle, and the Turks win hands down in this battle, and they won so thoroughly that they even captured Romanos IV, and he's taken prisoner by Alp Arslan, the Turkish Sultan. And he treats him very well if you read the primary sources. If you read Michael Attalitis, who's a primary source who chronicles that, he was treated very well. You know, he gave him food, he gave him Turkish clothes to wear. And because a thing about the Muslims, they've always been obsessed with the Roman Empire. In fact, if you read the Quran, Surah 30, it's called Surat al-Rum, Surah of the Romans. They've always loved the Roman Empire and have envied it. And so as soon as this sultan has the Roman emperor, also known as a Byzantine emperor, he's just fascinated. So he's like, oh, wow, this is pretty good. I'm going to, and so he's so nice to him. In fact, at one point, he asked Romanos, so if you had me captured and the situations were reversed, what would you do? He's like, I'd torture you probably. Let's be honest. And then Alp Arslan's like, oh, I would never do that to you. He was so nice to him. And then eventually he secures his release. They talked about forming an alliance with their kid, marrying their kid, etc. And basically, so they formed an alliance, and they formed kind of an agreement. And then Romanos goes back to Constantinople and he gets overthrown. So the Turks get mad at this because he was supposed to pay him some money, and then basically there's the Byzantine Empire in this point kind of devolves into chaos, palace intrigue. It essentially turns into the medieval version of Game of Thrones at this point. A lot of infighting, a lot of mercenaries. There's this interesting French mercenary, Norman in Anatolia named Roussel, and who's an interesting character. And to make a long story short, by 1079, Anatolia is completely overrun by Turks. I won't explain all the details in that. Now, the Turks from the Seljuks that have overrun Anatolia split from the main Seljuk Empire, and they form an empire called the Sultanate of Rum, the Roman Sultan. It's like the Turkish Roman Empire. Like I said, the Muslims like the Roman Empire. In fact, in 1453, when Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror takes Constantinople, he declared himself to be the Roman Empire. I've got the Roman Empire now. I'm the Roman Emperor. So anyway, let's get back to the Sultanate of Rum. The Seljuks have completely overrun the Middle East, including Jerusalem, the holy city. And so at this point in the 10s, Alexius Comnenus writes, who's the Byzantine Empire. And I just have to show you something. If you're interested in learning about Alexius Comnenus, his daughter named Anna Comnenus wrote a biography of him called the Alexiad, very famous, very too. It's interesting. She's actually gets an First Crusade from the Byzantine perspective, so that's interesting. I'm going to give a list of recommended reading afterwards. So yeah, I just forgot about that. That was over on my table. Okay, so where were we? Yeah. So he appeals to Pope Urban II for help. Pope Urban II has the Council of Clermont in 1095. He makes a speech. There's 5 accounts of the speech. And if you want to read them, you can read this book. It has all 5 accounts. And so if you're, he gives the speech and people start to flock to Constantinople. The goal was to meet up at Constantinople, save the Byzantine Empire, then capture the Holy Land. Now, the first wave of the Crusades, called the People's Crusade, they're like farmers with pitchforks. They were zealous. They got ferried across to Asia Minor. They raided a few forts, but as soon as they come up against the main Turkish army, they're completely wiped out. They're done. But the main body of the crusade, the knights and the vassals and all them, come from Europe. Alexius meets with all of them. And like he says, all right, you have to, if some stuff belonged to me, you have to give it back to me. And they made this deal with him that they would give back the land they take. And so eventually they're ferried across. Now, the first place they have to secure is Nicaea. That's the first main city into Anatolia, famous obviously for the Council of Nicaea in modern day Turkey. And so they siege Nicaea. It's sieged by 2 armies, the Crusader army and the soldiers of the Byzantine Empire, and they take Nicaea. So they've got Nicaea. Now, the Crusader, now keep in mind, this is the Sultanate of Rum. This is not the Seljuk Empire. The Crusaders are making their way through Anatolia, and the Byzantines are going behind them, just mopping up, capturing towns that they had lost and stuff, because now the Turks had lost their capital. Nicaea had been the capital of the Sultanate of Rum. Then after that, they moved it to a city called Konya, also known as Iconium. It's Konya in Turkish. And that's going to come up again in the Third Crusade. So what happens at this point is eventually the vanguard, they're making their way through Anatolia, and the vanguard, the front troops, they stray about a day, half a day ahead of the main army. And they're camping on a riverbed in Dorilaeum, and they get attacked by the entire Turkish army at dawn under Kilij Arslan. And they send a messenger back to the main army. They're saying, go get the main army and we'll hold them off. And they hold them off for 5 hours under Bohemond of Toronto, the son of the great Norman leader Robert Guiscard. And it's pretty amazing. They held them off. They were horrifically outnumbered. They managed to hold them off and then eventually the main force comes, led by Raymond of Toulouse, and they come and rout the Turks. So the Turks under the Sultanate of Rome are shaken. So they continue, the Crusaders, on their way to the city of Antioch, which had been an ancient patriarchate, a very huge city. Now, it's under Turkish control, but it's under the Seljuk Empire. It's not the Sultanate of Rome. So at this point, they are starting to siege the city, and it's taking long. It's taken a really long time because the walls are so big, and it's a very big city. And at this point, the Crusaders are starting to give up hope at this point. So they it starts to get pretty intense, and then they find out that a main army from Antioch, led by Kerbaga, is arriving and going to relieve the city, and then they're finished. So they really work hard to siege the city. Eventually, the Crusaders befriend I think it was an Armenian who had converted to Islam in the city, and they kind of befriend him, and he lets them in, and they take the city. And then they take the city, and then you still got this big army from Antioch coming. Then they go out and defeat the army from Antioch. It's really amazing, actually. It's they had a lot of horseshoes. Let's put it that way. Now, while this is going on, this whole city of Antioch is taken. It's a very important city, and it's hurting the Seljuk Empire. And while this is going on, since the Seljuk Empire is hurting so bad, the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt is able to go and take Jerusalem back, because they know there's this army there that's causing havoc for the Seljuks. And then at this point, the Fatimids send a letter to the Crusaders, we hear you're attacking the Turks. Turks are our enemy too. Maybe we can work together on this. The Crusaders weren't having any of that. They were coming for Jerusalem, which the Fatimids owned. And so Bohemond, who was the hero at the Battle of Dorilaeum, he basically takes Antioch and he sets up the Principality of Antioch. And meanwhile, while all this is happening, they also capture Edessa and set up the county of Edessa. But the main army goes down to Jerusalem and takes Jerusalem from the Fatimids. And then the Fatimids are sending an army to come up. And then the Crusaders exit the city to catch them off guard at the Battle of Ascalon. And at this point, the First Crusade is over. They established a kingdom of Jerusalem with Godfrey of Bouillon as the king of Jerusalem. They set up they've already got the Principality of Antioch and the county of Edessa. And a couple years later, they established the county of Tripoli. So there's 4 Crusader states that are at work now. And so life continues in the Crusader states for the next few decades. And now that they're there, they got to play politics there too. And eventually there's a Muslim ruler who is pretty charismatic. He's a jihadist. He starts doing some damage to the to the Crusader states. And in 1144, because they had captured Jerusalem in 1099, so in 1144, that's 45 years later, Zengi manages to take the county of Edessa from the Crusaders. So they've lost 1 out of 4 Crusader states. At that point, Pope Eugene III called the Second Crusade. So, and there's 2 main troops on this, the French and the Germans. The Second Crusade is a failure, but I'll say some details. It's not that eventful. You have the main army. The Germans are going through Anatolia again. They're going overland. And they have another battle at Dorylaeum again in 1147. This is exactly 50 years after the first battle of Dorylaeum. Now, the first battle of Dorylaeum, the Crusaders won. This one, it didn't go so well because they had adapted to German and French styles of warfare. And now Conrad, the German emperor, flees back to Constantinople, and then he takes a boat to the Holy Land. And then the French come, and the French lose their army as well. They skirted the coast to enter, but then they make a mistake. There was a port just before Turkish territory, and a whole bunch of the important people got on the ship. Therefore, the army was a lot smaller, and that army had to continue to Antioch. And basically, they got owned by the Turks. So meanwhile, in the Crusader states, they've lost most of their armies. They know they can't get the county of Edessa back. They make a really stupid mistake of attacking Damascus. Now Damascus was under Muslim control, but they were allied with that Muslim against Zengi, and they thought Zengi was going to capture Damascus, which is an important city. So the Crusaders do something stupid. They kind of backstab their Muslim ally in Damascus and try to attack it. It fails, and then Zengi takes Damascus. So it's kind of like, and so it's a huge failure, the Second Crusade. But an important thing about the Second Crusade, the King of France was on that crusade. He was King Louis VII. He was married to a lady named Eleanor of Aquitaine. And on the crusade, they get into a lot of fights. And she wants to seek an annulment. So as soon as they go back to Europe, she seeks an annulment and is able to the annulment. Now, at this point, she goes to England, Henry II. King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine produce an heir, and this heir is the greatest crusader in the history of the Crusades, Richard the Lionheart, and we're going to talk about him shortly. And so, so basically, the Second Crusade was a big failure. They couldn't get county of back, but at the end of the day, things were not horrible. They still had Jerusalem. They still had 3 Crusader states. I'm just going to take a sip of water. So things weren't horrible. And so then he dies and is succeeded by a guy equally dangerous named Nureddin. At this point, we're talking about the 60s. Keep in mind, in Egypt, you have the Fatimid Caliphate. There's a lot of internal corruption and infighting. It's essentially crumbling. So the question is, who takes over next? So Nureddin sends his agent Saladin to take control of the country, and he manages to take control of it by 1171. It's pretty impressive how he's able to do that. And he basically overthrows the Fatimid Caliph and says that they are only answerable to the Sunni Abbasid Caliph that's in Iraq. They're like, he's your caliph now. So they're under Sunni control. And now in the 1170s, Saladin tries to attack the Crusader kingdom, and he fails, especially in 1177 at the Battle of Montgisard. Saladin hugely outnumbered King Baldwin IV, who was the leper king, and but still, King Baldwin was an impressive general, and he was able to defeat Saladin despite being outnumbered. In some sources, say 7-1. He still beat Saladin, and he beat Saladin multiple times. See, that's the thing about Saladin. A lot of people think he was a brilliant general. He wasn't. He was a good statesman. He was a very good statesman. Around this time, I might save this for later. Yeah, I'll save that for later when we talk about that. But and so basically, Saladin settles for a peace treaty with the Crusader states. He wants to conquer them, but he knows he can't. Well, Baldwin the Fourth is king. Eventually, Baldwin the Fourth dies. He's replaced by Baldwin the Fifth, but he dies like a year later. And then you have a new king, Guy of Lusignan, who was married to the sister of King Baldwin IV. And he's not a good general. He's not Baldwin IV. And there's a lot of guys that don't like him. They say he's not a legitimate king. And around this time, a guy who is opposed to him was this renegade crusader named Reynald of Chatillon. And he goes and attacks a bunch of Muslims going on the Hajj to Mecca. And then these people were from Saladin's empire, and Saladin uses this as a way to break the truce with the Crusader states. So Guy of Lusignan, the king of the Crusader states, he goes to meet Saladin in battle at the Battle of Hattin, the famous Battle of Hattin in 1187, in July, I believe. Yeah, it's in July. So what happened at this point was because he thinks if he can beat Saladin, then there's no question about him being king. So he goes, unfortunately, he makes a bunch of mistakes going there. They don't have proper water supply. And this is the Middle East in July. So, I mean, it's pretty hot out there. So they engage Saladin at Hattin. Saladin is able to defeat the Crusaders. And he captures the True Cross as well. And he does a whole bunch of executions. He takes a bunch of, he executes tons of knights or hospitalers. He has Guy of Lusignan and Reynald in his tent, and he takes prisoner Guy of Lusignan, and he takes him prisoner by food. The same thing Alp Arslan IV. I've kind of noticed a pattern when a Muslim takes a Christian prisoner, you feed them food, he gives them a cup of water, there's some honey in it as well, and he takes a sip first to show him he's not trying to poison him, and he gives it to Guy of Lusignan, and he drinks it, then he hands it to Reynald of Chatillon. Basically, Reynald gets into it with, of course. Oh, I lost. I can't see you, Elijah. Right, I can.
Yeah, I'm right here. Sorry.
Saladin executes Reynald. Is it good?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
You're kind of going in and out there. It says it's kind of lagging. What I was going to do, I was going to open the door to my basement to get the Wi-Fi open a little more. So I'll be right back, but you continue talking and hopefully it clears up a little bit.
Okay, sure. Basically, Saladin executes Reynald of Chatillon, and let me check my notes here. And basically, 3 months later, he's able to capture Jerusalem, and he's able to take a lot of the Crusader kingdom. Because keep in mind, there's no army to oppose Saladin now, so he just mops up, and he's able to take everything except Tyre. And he can't take Tyre because of the impressive fortifications of Tyre. If you read all the Crusader chronicles, Christian and Muslim, they all talk about the fortifications at Tyre. In fact, there's a Muslim chronicler named Ibn Jubair, and he passes through the Crusader territories, and he marvels at the impressive fortifications of Tyre. And Conrad of Montferrat, a Crusader baron from Germany, comes and he also gives some troops to Tyre. And so then and now, to make things bad through the Crusaders, Conrad tries to usurp the crown of the kingdom of Jerusalem, and so he tries to become king as opposed to, because they have a king. He's captured. Guy of Lusignan. Just need some water.
And by the way, Al, this is impressive stuff. I mean, you seem like you know so much information that's packed into all this. Are you like reading notes, or is this like based off memory, or both? It's pretty impressive.
Mostly memory, although I have notes here because in case I lose my train of thought, which happens on occasion. I'm going to be taking a look at the notes more on the Fourth Crusade, because I've used multiple primary sources on that. So at this point, Pope Gregory the Eighth calls the Third Crusade. He basically tells the King of England and the King of France, guys, we've lost Jerusalem. Stop your war against each other. Go take Jerusalem. That's how powerful the Pope was back in those days. And so King Henry II had just died. So it's King Richard the Lionheart and King Philip II of France are on the crusade. And you also have Frederick Barbarossa. He goes overland. I'm talking about him in a moment. And the whole of and this is the Third Crusade, and one is the Super Bowl of, because all the big names are in charge. You have Saladin on the line, King and Frederick the Great. And so basically, for goes on Philip II and Richard the both a sea route. Now, keep in mind, although
Al, you're cutting out there. They're saying you're lagging. So let me see if we can maybe remove you here and then get you back in. Maybe that'll like kind of reset everything and make things a little better, if you don't mind.
Let me check something. I'll be back.
And whoever's watching right now, am I also lagging? Because I can't see myself on YouTube, but I can see him lagging. Am I also lagging, or is it just Al? Yeah, I got one of those Google Wi-Fi extenders. They don't work very well. But if I'm fine, then it may be on Al's end.
Okay, I'm trying to close a bunch of windows here just to make everything good. We'll close that.
And I appreciate everyone watching for letting us know.
Okay. All right. Can you hear my
Is it good?
Canadian voice.
That Canadian internet, eh? That's what somebody said here.
Yeah, it's a trendy web one.
Yeah, so it looks like go ahead and continue and then we'll see how it goes.
Sure. So you can start to I'm sure the folks in the chat will tell us if it gets choppy.
Yep.
All right. So we're starting the Third Crusade. Now, King Richard the Lionheart, although he's King of England, he owns about half of France too. And he owns it as a vassal to King Philip II. Sorry.
No worries.
Okay. His lands in France are a vassal of Philip II, and they're both on crusade. And so the first thing they need to do, the entire Holy Land except Tyre has been taken. So they need to secure the city of Acre. And they embark on a long siege there. And then eventually, it's a long siege. It lasts over a year. And eventually in 1191, they manage to take Acre. And then King Richard the Lionheart, there was going to be a prisoner exchange, but Saladin agreed to pay a tribute, and he kept stalling. And then eventually Richard, to show Saladin he wasn't playing games, he executes all 2,700 of the prisoners he has, just to say, look, I'm not playing games. You didn't pay me the money. And so all right, so let's pause for a second there. Meanwhile, you have Frederick Barbarossa. Oh, sorry. And on the way there, just rewind. I forgot to add something. A few of Richard's ships get caught in a storm and land at Cyprus. And the guy who is in control of Cyprus, he's a rogue leader of the Byzantine Empire. He had separated Cyprus from the Byzantine Empire. His name was Isaac Comnenus. And he was holding these ships hostage too, because he was actually secretly allied with Saladin. And so he basically, long story short, Richard captures the whole island. And then, okay, so that's all you need to know. And meanwhile, during the siege of Acre, Frederick Barbarossa is going overland. And he has to get through the Byzantine Empire. And now the current emperor is named Isaac II. Remember this name. Remember Isaac II. And he's in charge of the Byzantine Empire. And he tries to obstruct Frederick because he is allied with Saladin. The Byzantine Christian Empire is allied with Saladin on the Third Crusade. Just think about that for a moment. They ally with the enemy of Christendom. Anyway, and then, so basically, and so Isaac II won't ferry him across the Bosphorus into Anatolia. And then Frederick is like, all right, you want to play ball? I'm going to play ball. So he captures the city of Adrianople. And then he's like threatening him. It's like I could capture more, you know. And then eventually Isaac II is like, okay, I'll relent, I'll let you go. And so he's making his way through Anatolia now. This is Frederick's army. He attacks the capital of the Sultanate of Rum, which is Konya, and he smashes it. It's so impressive what he's doing. And then he completely loots the capital. And then what happens at this point is he starts to go the Holy Land. He's crossing a river, and then he drowns. He drowns. Like, that was... He was an old man at the time. He may have had like a heart attack. His horse may have bucked him off. The accounts are a bit blurry. But and then most of his army went home. It's kind of sad when you think about it, because things would have been an amazing, amazing in the Holy Land if he was there too. So meanwhile, let's get back to the Holy Land. So at this time, they've captured Acre. King Philip II pretends to be sick and leaves. He's like, my vows done, I'm leaving. So he goes back to Europe, and he starts stealing the land of Richard in France, even though it's under protection from the church. So what happens? But of course, Richard, it takes a while for him to figure out what's going on because he's in the Holy Land. And so he's marching south along the coast. Now, Saladin has just lost Acre. So Saladin decides to attack Richard with his main army. So it's main army against main army. Saladin has a 2-to-1 advantage. So Saladin tries to attack Richard. This is the only time they face off full army against full army. And Saladin gets completely owned. Then he's like, okay, I'm not going to do that again. Let me read some accounts of King Richard just to show how impressive of a warrior he was. This is historian Thomas Madden. He says, he was also a brilliant general, perhaps the best military mind of the Middle Ages. Mind you, that's a modern Catholic historian, so probably a bit biased. This is the biography of the Lionheart. It was written a few years after his death, and he captures the words of a Turk. A Turk had said, this is after the Battle of Jaffa, which we're going to talk about, truly, Lord, this Malik, now Malik is king in Arabic, of whom you ask is not the best of humanity. Such a knight has been, quote unquote, unheard of since time began. So steadfast, so doughty, so skilled in arms. He is the first in each exchange. He is unique in every undertaking. He heads the advance and is the last to retreat. We tried as best we could to capture him, but without success. No one can withstand his sword or his terrible charge unharmed. It is death to encounter him. His exploits are superhuman. Now, this is Saladin's biographer, Ibn Shaddad, and this is what he says about Richard. The king of mighty warrior, of great courage and strong in purpose. He had much experience of fighting and was intrepid in battle. So, I mean, basically, this guy is as good a warrior as you can get, essentially. And so he defeats Saladin. And in the meantime, there's the civil war going on between Conrad of Montferrat and Guy of Lusignan. Richard backs Guy of Lusignan. And so they try to work out an agreement. So they eventually agree to give Cyprus to Guy of Lusignan. He becomes king of Cyprus, and Conrad of Montferrat becomes the king of Jerusalem. But not long afterward, he's killed by an assassin, which is a radical Muslim sect. They made the game Assassin's Creed after the assassins, the old man of the mountain. And so he died. Then they put Henry of Champagne, they put Henry of Champagne as the king of Jerusalem. Now, basically at this point, Richard starts marching to Jerusalem. And then he says to himself, this isn't right. Before we do this, we need to take Egypt. But no crusaders wanted to take Egypt. He's like, look, it's easy.
Alan, you're choppy again.
Oh, okay.
Hello? Yeah, it looks like, I don't know if it's choppy for the viewers, but it's choppy for me. Let me see. I think you're good now. You came back.
Okay, so Richard says, let's try to take Egypt. It's easy to take. it's very simple to take, and that's the powerhouse. That's where Jerusalem gets its support. But no one wanted to do this. They're coming for the Holy Land, not Egypt, right? But eventually, in later crusades, in the 5th, 6th, and 7th Crusade, Egypt is a very important strategy that they try. And that was actually the plan for the 4th Crusade, but the 4th Crusade ran into other trouble. So the point is, he goes back to Acre. Now he's in Acre preparing to attack Beirut, because Saladin had captured Beirut a few years back. And while this happens, at this point, Saladin knows that this crusade will end in a treaty. So he tries to take the city of Jaffa to secure a better position in himself for a treaty. And what happens at this point is that he attacks Jaffa. And eventually, Richard hears about this. And he's like, no, we have to secure him. But he's only got a few ships. And he knows he can't fit more than a few hundred soldiers on the ships. The main army can't fit on the ships. And by the way, the main army is going to take 2 weeks to get there over land. And so he's like, all right, I'm going to take a few hundred soldiers on ships and then take them down. And the main army will have to go down, and we'll hold them off till the main army comes. So at this point, he shows up on the beach. He arrives, and Saladin is inside the walls of Jaffa. But he hasn't taken a city yet. The citadel is still holding out. A priest in the citadel jumps into the ocean, swims to Richard's ship, and says, they're about to take the citadel. You need to attack now. There's a whole bunch of Muslims on the beach. But as soon as Richard comes, he routs them all. And then he goes into the city with a small amount of troops and chases them all out. So he saved Jaffa. And then basically they retreat. But then Saladin hears word that the main army's coming down. And they're like, it's like, I need to attack Jaffa. There's only a few hundred soldiers under Richard, and we can capture Richard. We outnumber him like 10 or 20 to 1. Let's attack him. So they attack the next day morning. Richard lines up his few hundred knights. He's got like 10 cavalry. He lines up. They have pikes to stop the horse charge and shields, and every second guy is a crossbow guy. And a crossbow, there was 2 crossbows per crossbow guy. There's a guy behind them would reload while he's shooting it, so they can shoot constantly. And Saladin's army is almost completely on horse. And so then eventually Saladin comes, tries to advance, but his cavalry just keep getting picked off. And then it eventually came to the point where basically Saladin's telling his army to charge, and no one will charge. And then Richard, basically, he takes his lance and he rides up in front of the entire Muslim army, and he rides from the right flank all the way to the left with his lance, basically like taunting them. And Saladin's like, charge, but no one would charge. Huge humiliation for Saladin. Now Saladin, and then a month later, they sign a truce. It's consistent huge humiliation for Saladin, because although they didn't capture Jerusalem, they captured a lot back. They captured a ton of coastal area and a bunch of other areas. And so the Crusader states were up and running again. So things were good. And then he goes back to Europe to fight for his lands back from Philip II. By the way, he had every plan on coming back. He was still fairly young. He was only in his 30s at this point, while Saladin was an older guy. So to make a long story short, a few months after they leave, Saladin dies, and a few years later, Richard dies. He's in a siege, and he dies. He gets hit in the shoulder with a crossbow bolt. It's not a fatal wound, but his surgeon screwed up, and it became gangrene, and then that was all. That was the end of Richard. All right, so that's what, and that's the end of the Third Crusade. So we're about 1200. Meanwhile, we're going to rewind back to 1100, and I'll briefly recap what's been going on in the Byzantine Empire. So you have Alexius Comnenus, you have his son John Comnenus, and his son Manuel Comnenus. And basically, they're slowly able to take more land back from the Turks, and eventually Manuel Comnenus in 1176, he manages to he's like, I'm going to do a crusade of my own. I'm going to take the Roman army and flush the Turks out of Anatolia once for all. And so he marches into Turkish territory, engages the Turks at the Battle of Myricephalum, and then he loses essentially, and then they lose more land. They lose the city of Dorylaeum, and so and then he dies in 1180. And then his son Alexius II takes over. Now, remember the Byzantine Empire 100 years prior had a Game of Thrones moment. They're about to go back into Game of Thrones. They're fighting for the crown. So his successor Alexius II is very young. He's like 9 years old, and since he's young, basically everyone. He does not have authority. So a guy named Andronicus Comnenus, who was like a general he basically comes to Constantinople to stir the pot. He was a general from Anatolia. And then this is when the famous massacre of the Latins happens in 1182, where thousands of Latins were murdered in Constantinople, including a cardinal who was the papal legate. They had chopped his head off and attached it to the tail of a dog, and it ran through the city. Horrible. And so basically Andronicus kills Alexius II and becomes emperor. Then a couple years later, there's the guy named Isaac II. He kills Andronicus and becomes emperor. Okay. Then 10 years after that, that's the guy who tries to obstruct Frederick. In 1195, a guy named, his brother named Alexius, he has him blinded and thrown in prison, and Alexius is the new emperor. And so that's what's going on in the Byzantine, and the whole empire is in rebellion. The Normans are invading, the Hungarians are invading. Basically, the whole empire is in rebellion, very politically unstable. And so at this point, you kind of have an idea what's going on in the Holy Land, the Byzantine Empire in Europe. We're on the eve of the Fourth Crusade. And we're about to get to the main event, the Conor versus Khabib, the Fourth Crusade. But can we play that clip?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and play it now.
Yep, yeah, I've got a clip here.
Pedagogical purposes, like.
Let me know when you're ready.
Yep.
Sweet.
To use that date, 1054, as the date for the Great Schism. Just so you know, nobody believed that at the time. In 1054, no one in the West or in the East thought that marked the Great Schism, and that was somehow, the road that we shouldn't have crossed, and that was the end. if we really had to pin a date, I think a much better date to solidify the sense of the Great Schism is the Sack of Constantinople in 1204 during the Fourth Crusade. It was at that time when the Latin Crusaders got misdirected and they came into Constantinople and killed our bishops and priests and raped our nuns on our altars. That is when we said, you know what, I don't think we're one.
So, what do you think about that that clip, Elijah?
Well, I've heard that from the East, but I don't know if that's fair because, didn't they do the same thing to the Latins prior to that?
Yeah, there was a massacre in 1182. There was also a massacre in 1171. There's some treachery there, plus allying with Saladin, which was treachery. But we're going to get to the whole story of Constantinople. So I suppose so. We're sitting at about 1200 approximately, and are you fairly up to date? You think I did a good job explaining the first three?
Absolutely. You did a fantastic job. I mean, you exceeded my expectations. This is incredible. I mean, I'm going to go back and listen to this probably a couple times because there's so much information that I just got to sit down and take notes because you're just giving things. And I'm excited to see what your book list is at the end here because I do want to get into this topic. I've always meant to get into this topic because, like you said, it's one of the fun topics. I've never really sat down and researched this or read anything.
Well, shall we start the main event? Conor versus Khabib?
Let's do
Ali
it.
versus Frazier?
Let's do it.
All right, the main event. All right. So a few years before 1200, we get a new pope, Pope Innocent III. He calls the Fourth Crusade. Now, basically, there's a priest in France named Fulk who goes around preaching this crusade, a lot of zeal. Apparently, he performs a lot of miracles. Very holy man, according to the primary sources. Basically, he arrives at a tournament in Champagne. There's a bunch of knights at a tournament, and he convinces them to take the cross and go on crusade. The main guy is a guy named Thibaut of Champagne. Now, word spreads and more people take the cross, including Baldwin of Flanders. He's an important guy, got to remember him. And Geoffrey of Villehardouin, who's the Marshal of Champagne, who actually wrote a primary source. He wrote this, and it's a very good primary source. I've got it over there on my desk. I'll just So, all right. And so now, since all these knights are in France, they don't have ships, and they want to take ships and sail to the Holy Land. So they try to go to some coastal towns that have a lot of ships. They go to, I think, Pisa. They can't give enough. No, sorry. They go to Genoa. They can't have. They're like, we can't get that many ships together. They go to Venice, and they meet with the Doge. The king of Venice is the Doge, Doge. I don't know why he's called that. So the Doge. Each time we say the Doge, just think the king of Venice. They go to Venice and they say the top crusaders meet with the Doge, and they're like, we need X amount of ships and supplies. Can you deliver? And then he takes a week to discuss it. He comes back to the Crusaders. He's like, we can do this. And so the Doge is named Enrico Dandolo. Now, around this time, Thibaut of Champagne, he dies. And so they have to get a new leader. So they get Boniface of Montferrat, and he's the new leader of the crusade. Now, so they make a deal with Enrico Dandolo that they would have 20,000 soldiers. They needed ships and supplies for 20,000 soldiers, 9,000 squires, and 4,500 knights, for a total of 33,500 people. A lot of ships. Now, and also 4,500 horses. So quite a bit, 1,000 marks. The Crusaders and the Doge agree on that amount of money and that amount of supplies, and then they get to work. It's so big that Enrico Dandolo, the Doge, tells all the merchants in Venice for the next year, no one is allowed to do business outside of this crusade. That's how big this project was. And in the meantime, they send their agreements to the Pope, and they're like, we made this deal with the Venetians, and the Pope's like, all right, this is good, keep going. So, and now the plan for them is to go to Egypt to do what Richard had wanted to do. But since a lot of people don't want to do that, they kept that a secret. So, okay, it's 1202 at this point. Now, let me just, all right, then the Crusaders, they send out word all over Europe. They're like, come to Venice, and basically that 94,000 marks, they divide that by the amount of Crusaders they think they'll have, and basically say like a per man charge, essentially. And so, unfortunately, a lot of Crusaders go to other ports, and not enough show up, and basically only about a third show up. So they've, and then of course the Venetians are mad because they want their money, and if there's only a third, you can't really pay the full amount. So they're like, all right, all the Crusaders have to empty their pockets. They empty their pockets, and there's still 34,000 marks left. The primary sources are a tad contradictory, but I'm going with Villehardouin, who is, since this guy was like an administrator on the crusade, he would know, as opposed to like a knight. I got Robert of Clary. He's a knight. I used his source. I also got one by a priest who was a chaplain on the crusade. And of course, there's another one. I can't afford it, but it's online for free. That's a Byzantine account. So basically, after everything, they're short 34,000 marks. And then the Doge is not happy. So he's like, okay, I won't charge any interest as long as you capture the city of Zara, because the Venetians and the Hungarians were fighting over cities of Zara. And so, and at this point, the Venetians, including the Doge, Enrico Dandolo, decide to take the cross themselves and go on the crusade. And by the way, a tiny tidbit I forgot to add: the Doge, Enrico Dandolo, was over 90 years old and completely blind, but he still had all his mental faculties intact. If you read the primary sources, it's unclear how he got blinded. He may have got a head injury earlier in life. It's unknown, but the point is he's blind, but he still got all his marbles. And so they go to Zara, and they capture Zara from the King of Hungary. When the Pope gets wind of this, he's furious. Not only have they attacked a fellow Christian city, Zara, it's on the coast of the Adriatic. It's the modern city of Zadar in Croatia. And so so they take Zara and they spend the winter there. Now the Pope is furious because the King of Hungary is under a crusader vow. So not only have they attacked a Christian city, they've attacked property of a fellow crusader. So that was the Pope excommunicates the entire crusade at this point and suspends the indulgence. So at this point, the French basically send an envoy to the Pope saying, we had no choice, blah, blah, blah. They basically begged to be unexcommunicated and the indulgence there. And so what happens is he forgives the French, but not the Venetians, because the Venetians under Enrico Dandolo was like, no, we were in the right to do that. So where are we now? Okay, now at this point, a new player enters the picture, and his name is Alexius. Now, I know this is confusing. There are a lot of Alexiuses in this story, so I'll try my best to differentiate them. But so you've got this guy named Alexius, who's a prince. His sister is married to Philip of Swabia, and Boniface of Montferrat was, and basically Philip of Swabia puts Boniface of Montferrat in touch with Alexius. He is the son of Isaac II. I told you to remember that name. Hope everyone remembered. Who's blind in a dungeon in Constantinople. And basically, King Isaac, or Isaac II's brother, is currently the emperor. His name's also Alexius. So we got Alexius uncle and young Alexius. All right, is everyone? I hope no one's confused at this point. So, so basically, Alexius comes to an agreement with the Crusaders. Young Alexius, he says, "Look, you need money, right? Right?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, we do." And he's like, well, I need to get my father back on the throne and me on the throne because we're in that dynasty. We got to overthrow my evil uncle. So how about you take me to Constantinople? You put us on the throne and depose bad uncle Alexius. And I will pay. And then he makes big promises. I'll tell you what they are: 200,000 marks, which is more than enough to pay for their debt, and a bunch more. That he promises also to join the crusade himself with 10,000 Byzantine troops and establish a permanent garrison of 500 knights in the Holy Land. Impressive promises. Then the Crusaders at this time, they start to discuss options. And they agree. A lot of people were against this, but they ultimately agree to go take this detour to Constantinople, and they signed a treaty. So it's on paper, an official treaty. So they leave for Constantinople. Now their ships arrive at Constantinople. They dock at Chalcedon, which is just across the Bosphorus in Asia Minor. And the Crusaders are attacked by a squadron of Byzantine troops, and the Crusader knights completely rout the Byzantine troops. Then a ship comes over from Constantinople. It's a guy carrying a message from Alexius, who's on the throne there. And it's a very polite message. It's like, oh, okay, we hear you're on the way to the Holy Land. Don't let us trouble you. That you're trying to get Jerusalem and the true cross back. We wish you the best of luck. We'll even give you some money. And so very kindly, he's being very kind. Then the Crusaders eventually say no. They're here to put young Alexius on the throne, or possibly his father. So basically, they need to get into the Golden Horn to show the young emperor, the young Prince Alexius to the people. And then so there's a giant chain that is across the gateway to the Golden Horn. So it's funny because in 1453, when Mehmet the Conqueror was assaulting the city, he moved his ships overland. The Crusaders just captured the tower and lowered the chain. I don't know what. Anyway, the point is they get into the Golden Horn. They show young Alexius to all the people on the walls of the city, and he thought they would welcome him as a hero, but they're not too happy to see him. And this may have been Alexius III, who was a tyrant. So now, according to one primary source, some people, they pulled their pants down and showed their backside. Basically, you're not welcome. We don't want you. So then they attacked the city by land and water. But it's a failure. They've got the ships from Venice in the harbor, and they've got the land army, that's the French. And so they're very low on supplies. And basically, they attack the seawalls again, and they're able to capture 25 towers and set some fires in the city. An interesting thing about Constantinople, it's all made of wood. There's a lot of wood, so that there's a lot of fires often. This happened in the Turkish period as well. So but basically, okay, so you got a bunch of ships in the Golden Horn, which is a body of water north of the city. You got land forces. And basically, Alexius, who's the current emperor, Alexius III, the bad uncle, he starts to panic. He's fearing a coup at this point. So he flees in the middle of the night. But before he does, he takes a bunch of money out of the treasury with him. Remember, the young Alexius had promised a bunch of money to the Crusaders. So this is going to cause problems. Now, as soon as people realize the bad uncle Alexius III is gone, they drag Isaac II out of prison and put him back on the throne. He says to open up the door and let my son come in. You got young Alexius coming in, and they crown Alexius. Since Isaac II was like old and frail, they have him emperor, but they also make Alexius co-emperor. They did that often when one was about to die. So, and he's made Alexius IV. So now the two Alexiuses have numbers. I'll be referring to them as back. So Alexius III is out of the picture. So Alexius IV, I need some water. So Alexius the fourth is in power now. Along with basically the Crusaders approached Isaac II and said, "Look, your son Alexius promised all this money, 10,000 troops, 500 knights in the Holy Land. Oh, and also, I may have forgot to say this, but he also promised he'd put the Patriarch of Constantinople in submission to the Pope in Rome. He also promised, I think I forgot that. Shame on me. Anyway, so unite the churches. And this is all presented before Isaac. And then he's like, wow, that's a pretty hefty promise. But you have done such a service for us that will honor this promise. So you had two emperors who said they'd honor this promise. So they only have about enough cash to pay half of the 200,000 marks that he owes them, and half goes to the Venetians, half goes to the French. Except the French have to give most of theirs to the Venetians to pay their debts. So they pay their debt, and the rest that the French had went to the people who paid extra. So the French really don't have any money. But all the debts are paid now between the French and Venetians. And so then basically Alexius says, give me a bit of time. And then they said, okay. It's like, and basically, remember, the whole empire is kind of in revolt at this point. So basically, Alexius is like, oh, I've got to go capture a bunch of land back. I only have Constantinople. So he goes. The Crusaders go with him, some Crusaders. But then eventually they find out he's not paying the money, so they go back to Constantinople. Then Alexius comes back, and they ask him for money. And then he basically starts ignoring them. Alexius IV starts ignoring the Crusaders. Then eventually the Crusaders are kind of angry. They've at this point, actually, an exiled Turkish prince from Konya, they come and say, to the Crusaders, I saw what you did with Alexius IV. Impressive. Why don't you do the same thing for me? Put me on the throne of the Turkish Sultan. I'll convert the Turks to Christianity and pay you a bunch of money. They considered it, but said no, ultimately. And basically in the Byzantine Empire, they're having a tough time submitting the Bulgarians. The Bulgarians want to be independent. And so basically Alexius IV, at this point, he's just ignoring the Crusaders. Now, the top Crusaders, so Enrico Dandolo, the Doge of Venice, Boniface of Montferrat, they march into the royal chambers in Constantinople and say, pay up, or else. They're very threatening. And then basically they're told no. And basically what happens at this point is Alexius backstabs them. He sends a fleet to attack the Venetian fleet. It fails miserably. Now, around this time, Isaac II, he dies of old age. The primary sources are a bit contradictory when he dies, but he dies around this point. And at this point, Alexius IV is the sole emperor, and he's very unpopular. The Crusaders don't like him because he's backstabbed them. The people in Constantinople don't like them because he's brought the Crusaders there and gave a lot of the city's wealth to the Crusaders. And so he's not popular either. Now, in the court of Alexius IV, there's a guy named Mortzophilus. Mortzophilus was his nickname. His real name was Alexius. I know. This is it's too many Alexiuses, right? So he one night, Mortzophilus, we'll call him Mortzophilus just to avoid confusion, kills Alexius IV and takes the throne, and he's crowned in Hagia Sophia. He tried to lie and say Alexius IV died of natural causes, but it eventually came out he murdered him. But the people didn't care. The people of Constantinople are happy that they have an anti-crusader in power. He wants nothing to do. He's not going to pay them a thing they ask. No money, no church reunification, no 10,000 troops for the crusade, no 500 knights, nothing. So the Crusaders okay, and then the basically at this time the crusade leaders meet with the crusader clergy, and basically the clergy say These people stabbed you in the back. They betrayed you. They didn't fulfill their end of the bargain. You did your end of the bargain. An attack on the city is justified. And if you read one primary source, Robert of Clery, the Crusader chaplains say that the Byzantines are worse than the Jews because of their treachery, worse than the Jews. Now, at this point, the Crusaders are very low on supplies. You've got the ships in the Golden Horn, and you got the French knights in front of the land walls. And so the French knights go and raid the countryside to get supplies because they're low. And then Martzophilus sends out an army to attack the Crusaders. And he gets completely owned. They had this icon of the Virgin Mary they carried into battle that got captured. They captured his standard. They almost captured Martzophilus himself. Oh, and by the way, Martzophilus, his name is Alexius V, but we're going to keep calling him Martzophilus. And basically, he goes back to Constantinople. And at this time, the Bulgarians appealed to the Crusaders, like, can you make us independent? The Crusaders said, no, we don't have time for that. So the Bulgarians appealed to the Pope, and he sends a crown. So then now the Crusaders plan to attack Constantinople head on. They've been betrayed and backstabbed. 2 emperors had agreed to those promises. So the empire officially owed the Crusaders that money. They first do a naval attack, and it fails. And then they attack a few days later when they had winds a bit better. And it was a success. They managed to get on the walls, and they managed to break a hole in a wall on the sea walls. And basically, at this point, they're in the city. They light some fires to intimidate them. And they basically manage to get some troops to open the door, and the French Crusaders come in. The Crusaders have the city. At this time, Martzophilus flees because he knows he's finished. So he flees. The Crusaders have Constantinople, and the Byzantine Empire had owed them money. And so they engaged in massive looting. They looted the city. They looted every church. A famous loot. They relics. The Crusade clergy took the relics, because clergy, they're not allowed to have a lot of money, so they take all the saints' relics, including the Shroud of Turin. The most famous thing that was stolen from the Church of the Holy Apostles was these bronze horses. They were taken back to Venice. And apparently, you can still see them if you go to St. Mark's Church in Venice. The bronze horses are still there. And so they loot the city entirely. And about 2,000 civilians are killed, according to the primary sources. There were rapes, including nuns. There were, according to Cognatus, who is the Greek source. So that's not good. But of the 2,000 killed, a lot of that was not done by the Crusaders. A lot of that was done by the Latins living in the city, kind of to get back revenge for the massacre in the 1180s. So yeah, there was no mass slaughter. By the way, in terms of timing, this is April 1204. At this point, they make Baldwin of Flanders the new Roman emperor. And then eventually they start to go out and conquer land. They get Adrianople. And so that's essentially the time. That's essentially the end. There was a massive looting, but now you know the whole context. I showed a clip from that priest there. He didn't give the context. He was not given to talk about the Crusades, but most people know that kind of soundbite. They don't know the whole context. And by the way, what happens at this point? basically the whole empire is in rebellion, and not to do with this. Basically, there's a bunch of Byzantine successor states, the Empire of Trebizond, the Empire of Nicaea, the Despotate of Epirus, and a whole bunch of smaller ones. And remember, you have two claimants to the emperor still floating around somewhere in the empire, Alexius III and Mortzophilus. And it's kind of ironic what happens to them, because eventually they meet up and they're like, we need to take Constantinople back from the Latin Crusaders. So they join their forces, but Alexius the Third turns on Mortzophilus and blinds him. And so Mortzophilus is basically blind, and he's wandering the countryside of the empire blind. And eventually he's picked up by a patrol of crusaders who take him back to Constantinople as prisoner. And they decide, now he was from a very prestigious family, the Ducas family, which, if you know Byzantine history, that's an important family. And so they're like, well, he's a very high man in terms of status. He should be given a high execution. So they take him to a pillar, a long, tall pillar, and he's blind. So they just march him up the stairs and push, and that's the end of Mortzophilus. And by the way, according to the primary source, Gunther of Paris, that pillar had belonged to a stylite back in the day, like a monk who would just sit on pillars and pray all the time. That used to belong to a stylite. So at this point, I'm going to give my conclusion of the whole event. So let me get a glass of water. Okay. In conclusion, two Christian cities were attacked on this crusade, Zara and Constantinople. When's the last time you've heard the Hungarians complain about Zara? Yeah, you know what I mean. And Zara is innocent. They did absolutely nothing, whereas Constantinople, they betrayed the Crusaders. The Crusaders were brought to Constantinople by the Byzantines. They were made promises by two emperors from the Byzantines. They only got half the money. They didn't. The Byzantines paid half the money. They didn't unite the churches. They didn't give 10,000 troops or 500 knights for the crusade. The Crusaders upheld their end of the bargain. They did everything that was asked of them. They used their resources. They used their time, their money, their ships, their manpower, fulfilling their end of the bargain. And they only got half the money. They didn't unite the churches. They didn't send the troops or the knights. So this is betrayal to the highest degree by the Byzantine Empire. Hence, the sack of Constantinople is the fault of the Byzantines. That's my conclusion. It's the Byzantines' fault. And I'm going to give a quote from Timothy Ware in his book, The Orthodox Church. He talks about this episode, and he gives a bit more information than that priest did. But we're going to... Okay. The Crusaders were originally bound for Egypt, but were persuaded by Alexius, son of Isaac Angelus, the dispossessed emperor of Byzantium, to turn aside to Constantinople in order to restore him and his father to the throne. So far, so good. That's right. The Western intervention in Byzantine politics did not go happily, and eventually the Crusaders, disgusted by what they regarded as Greek duplicity, lost patience and sacked the city. That is a lie. That's a lie. You know, this guy's a bishop in the Orthodox Church, and he can boldly lie like that. So, as again,
it's all polemical, right?
Yeah, I conclude it's to blame on the Byzantines and not the Crusaders. I'm going to give some recommended reading. This book, I don't know why that's there. This book is has Joinville and Villehardouin. I mentioned Villehardouin was the Marshal of Champagne who was in charge of the admin. He wrote a chronicle on this crusade, and it continues to about 1208. So like 4 years into the new Latin Empire of Constantinople. And so that's half the book. The second half of the book is a chronicle of the 7th crusade. That's King Louis IX's crusade. So, like, of course, we didn't talk about that today, but that's what you get. It's 2 in 1. So that's it. This is very simple. It's $23.70 something to purchase this on Amazon.ca. So that's probably less than $20 American. So it's not hard to get. I've got other primary sources, but they're more expensive. But if you get this, this will give you the... So, yeah, are there any questions?
Yeah, and first of all, I just want to say thank you and applaud you here. This was an excellent, excellent presentation. And I thank you for doing this. You know, for me, it's 12:40 at midnight. I don't know what time it is for you. I think it's a little earlier, but it's late anyway, either way. So I really appreciate you being here and putting in this work. And we do have some questions here. I have a question from Trendy Web 1. He says, or she says, I'm not sure if it's he or she. I've read that the Pope excommunicated the Crusaders after the sack. Is this true?
No. He was very angry. The sack of Zara, yes. The sack of Constantinople, no. And of course, after Zara, the French Crusaders got unexcommunicated. But when they got to Constantinople, the Pope was mad because that was not the plan. He never said to do that. But at the same time, he's like, now let's make the best out of a bad situation. At least we got the city. Yeah, so he didn't excommunicate him, but he was angry.
Okay, that makes sense. And then we have a question from Ryan Pope. He says, question for Allan. In your opinion, what barriers does the historical conflict pose for Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic reconciliation? Or is it not a critical issue 800 years later?
I mean, I don't think it plays a role in reconciliation. Like John Paul II apologized to Patriarch Bartholomew for this, although I don't think John Paul II knew the whole story, how the Crusaders were horrifically betrayed by the Byzantine Empire. I think the Byzantine, like, of course, I don't blame the Orthodox Church for this. I blame the Byzantine Empire because of their treachery. In terms of reconciliation, I mean, it's a political event, you know, if there's talks, like, for example, at Florence, they didn't talk about this. At Florence, they signs, the filioque, purgatory, etc. Discuss the but so no, I don't think this is a hurdle for reconciliation. But I do think the Greeks and also other Orthodox people should stop bringing this up, because there is a whole context to this that they don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've always had that hunch. There's always two sides to the story, and I appreciate you presenting the balance. And that's what I love doing here on this show is I like just to present the balance, right? There's so much polemical work out there on both sides of the fence, right? But I like to kind of balance things out. You know, I hope I've never attacked Eastern Orthodoxy on my channel, and I if I have, I apologize. That's not what I want to do. Yeah, can you hear me? Hello?
Oh, hi.
There you are. I don't know if you heard any of that.
You said you like to balance things out, and then it went blank.
Yeah, I like to balance things out. I don't like to be polemical, so I hope I'm not polemical, and that's what you're doing here. Is you're balancing out and putting the context and showing that there are two sides to the story. Now we do have another question here. It says, "Can Allan share all the sources?" I think he meant later. This is from Gabriel. Maybe in the comment section, or if you want to send them to me, I can put them in the description, and we can share all the sources there on the video.
I could show the sources right now. I showed the first source. That's the one. If you're only going to read one source, this is the one to read.
And that's the next question, because it's kind of hard to see on the video. It's the question is, what's the title of the book?
Well, the book's just called Chronicles of the Crusades. And it's Geoffroy of Villehardouin, The Conquest of Constantinople. And that's half of this book. And then the other half is King Louis's Crusade.
Okay, sweet. Let me see here. There are some more. Here's a good question from Elijah Halberg. What was the role of the Pope with the installation of the new Latin Patriarch?
Well, of course, they controlled Constantinople till 1261, until a Byzantine successor state came back in and took it. It was kind of embarrassing how they managed to get it back, but I won't go into that. But the point is, a lot of the Byzantine successor states start talking with the Pope, because they're like, "Oh, we'll put the Patriarch of Constantinople under the Pope if you give us Constantinople back," and stuff like that. But they didn't. But of course, this is politicians talking, not the church people. Like the priests and the monks and the bishops, they don't want that. But of course, a politician, he doesn't care. Like I'll do what I want. And so, yeah, and of course, in the 1200s, there were a few ecumenical councils where the Fourth Lateran Council, where you had Constantinople under control of the Latins, and there's an ecumenical council when that happened. And that's a point that's interesting. In 1235, if you go back to the 1235, 4 out of the 5 of the main patriarchs are under Catholic control. They had Jerusalem back at that point. They had Antioch. They had Constantinople and Rome, obviously. And the only one they didn't have is Alexandria. So, yeah.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm there.
Okay, sweet. So we have another question here, Allan. Why do you think so many are ignorant of the massacre of the Latins? And that's a question I wonder as well.
I don't think they're as ignorant of the massacre of the Latins as they are of the treachery of the Byzantines. There, like, a few more people know about this. Like, on the same page I read in Callistus Ware's book, they talk about the massacre of the Latins, but they try to say, well, that was bad, but that pales in comparison to the sack of Constantinople, so I think they're less ignorant of that. They just say, well, it's not a big deal because you committed the ultimate crime,
I see. Okay. And here's a question here. What was the cause of the massacre of the Latins, and why did it occur?
Okay. It happened because the Latins had trading privileges that they didn't have. So there was a lot of resentment, and there was a lot of instability because Alexius II was the emperor, and he was like 9 years old. And this bad guy named Andronicus Comnenus from Anatolia comes and starts to rile people up. And this is when the massacre of the Latins happens, because they're basically trying to find a scapegoat, and he leads them toward the Latin Quarter, and and the rest is history.
Makes sense. That makes sense. Let me see here. And we'll take one more question, and feel free to refuse this one if it's not something that, and it's a good question, don't get me wrong, but if it's not something you're prepared to answer right now, because might be a little bit kind of a different thing here. But can you tell us something brief about the papal bull Dom Diversas to have a better context of it? It's being used to undermine the Pope and the Catholic Church as authorizing slavery as an effect of it.
Okay, is that the that may be one of two? Is that the one with Pope Alexander the Sixth, or is that the one in 1452 when the Pope, I can't remember his name, he sent it to the Portuguese, the King of Portugal? Is that one?
Let me see here, because I am not familiar with this myself. I'm more of a first millennium, fast forward to the Gasser Relatio. Let's see here. It's 1452 Pope Nicholas the Fifth.
Yeah, that's one. Okay, so that one at that time, keep in mind this is 1452, a year before Constantinople falls to the Turks. Now at this time you had at this time they knew the Turks were going to attack Constantinople with a very big army, and you have and there was no one to fight the Turks. You had the King of Hungary was threatening the Turks, John Hunyadi, but he was not. He couldn't do that much damage. So, and basically everyone is in Europe was at war with someone. The Spanish were finishing off the Reconquista; they were in the final stages. The French and English were finishing off the 100 Years' War. In fact, the 100 Years' War actually ended in the fall of 1453. That was the other big thing that happened in 1453. The Germans were at war. The Polish were at war. Everyone was at war except the Portuguese. The Portuguese weren't doing anything. So he sends a papal bull. The Pope sends a papal bull, I think, to the King of Portugal, and basically says he's so desperate at this point because he's allied with the Byzantine Empire because of the Union of Florence, which is being held in there by Constantine the 11th. And he basically tells the King of Portugal, you have carte blanche, do whatever you want to these people. So it was an act of desperation. He attack them, enslave them. Yes, the Pope shouldn't have done that, but keep in mind the situation he was in. You had this ancient Christian city is on the brink of falling. No one else can do anything except the King of Portugal, and so basically he's pleading with them, just do whatever you want, just stop Turks. And so that's the context. So now that you know the context, it makes a bit more sense. He probably shouldn't have gone as far as he did, but he was in a state of desperation because of what the Turks were doing.
Thanks for answering that. I appreciate it, Al. So I think that I don't see any more questions. So I think we're going to wrap it up here. Just want to remind everyone, tomorrow on Allan Ruhl's YouTube channel, don't forget to subscribe there. I will be on at 12 p.m. Eastern to talk about the Relatio of Gasser. That's going to be the topic. So you don't want to miss that. So subscribe and hit the notification bell for his channel, so that way you're reminded of that and other future content, because he has some great stuff. And then, as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel, Underground Catholicism, and share this video. I think this has been great. I think this is great for kind of like, there's this online dialogue between East and West that we're all involved in. It's always nice to have this where, I can reference something. Hey, somebody says something about this topic. I point them here because you kind of lay it all out in a very nice way. So I appreciate you doing that. Appreciate you being here. Everyone, have a great night and God bless. And, I've had 4 hours of sleep, so I'm excited to end this and get some get some rest. It's 1 o'clock here. So God bless everybody. Have a good one.
God bless everyone.